Wednesday, January 11th, 2017. This is 3000 NFL Mock Draft, a weekly draft podcast. But during the NFL playoffs, what better thing to focus on than the Seattle Seahawks and the NFL playoffs, as we are from fieldgoals.com, myself, Kenneth Arthur, and SeahawksDraftBlog.com, my co-host, Rob Staten. We are talking about the Seahawks. They give us one more game, at least, to talk about on the show. They beat the Detroit Lions 26-6 in the wild card round. They get into the second round of the playoffs for the fifth straight season. They're facing the Atlanta Falcons, where they were 5 years ago. And here we go, 4 years ago. And here we go again for the Seattle Seahawks. Just 2 wins away from the Super Bowl, doing the Lord's work. Here we go, with another great season. I think that you have to say that it has been a successful season. When you get into this place, I think that there's a lot of people who would have wanted a more dominant thing. Being at home right now would certainly be ideal, but the Seahawks, despite everything, have put themselves in a position that 24 teams did not put themselves in for the season. We also have things to talk about in terms of the Clemson upset over Alabama, which, of course, we talked about all season long, and it came to a head, and not expecting Alabama to lose a game this year. They did. We can talk about the coaching hires for the Denver Broncos and the Buffalo Bills and some other things that are, perhaps happening for the Rams or 49ers. And moving on to the other playoff games. But we'll start with the Seahawks, Rob. There was, I think, on my part, and on your part and most people's part, some confidence going against the Detroit Lions because they had such a bad defense, because the game was in Seattle, because overall Matthew Stafford's with his finger being broken, there were a lot of things going in the favor of Seattle. Then they won by 20 points. Certainly, it was a little bit more of a stressful game going into, the third quarter. Then Paul Richardson with the incredible catch for the touchdown. A little bit of controversy created there by, NBC, and then, sort of being blown up by so many people out there that don't want to see the Seahawks succeed. And, whether we can call it you can certainly say if it's by the letter of the law, a penalty, the fact that the pass interference was being committed on Paul Richardson at that time. Can we really call it a fair penalty to call on Paul Richardson when he's being draped upon by the defensive player? But moving past that, they kept going on. 2 more great catches by Paul Richardson, an incredible catch by Doug Baldwin. This was the better team winning for sure in the wild card round. But in the Atlanta Falcons game, you're getting the number 2 seed at home, the number 1 offense, lots of things that the Atlanta Falcons have that the Detroit Lions did not have. Rob, we saw a great run game from Thomas Rawls and the Seahawks. What about that rushing attack gives you confidence or pause against the Lions? Do you think that it was something that, because there is talk about whether or not it was a change in philosophy, and there's also talk about Pete Carroll saying there was no change. It was a normal thing. We went out there and we did what we normally do, and it was just more successful. Do you think that what they did against the Lions is repeatable this weekend?
Certainly, it's repeatable. I guess the one thing that gives me pause for thought is that the Seahawks have been a really inconsistent team for quite a long time now. So going all the way back to the Tampa Bay game, they went into that game off the back of a 3-game winning streak. Tampa Bay were horrendous. Then they came back the next week and beat the Panthers, scoring 40 points in the process. Ran the ball really well. The sentiment after that game was, okay, the Seahawks are back on track now. Tampa Bay's it's just one of those days. It was one of those days. Move on. They're back on track, and then the following week they go and get blown out by the Packers. So then you're concerned about that. They come back and they toil a little bit against Los Angeles before pulling away and winning comprehensively. You think, okay, they've moved on from Green Bay, but then against Arizona they come out and have possibly the worst first half of football they've had all year. End up losing at home to the Cardinals, end up blowing the opportunity to be playing this game at CenturyLink instead of in Georgia. And then against San Francisco, the worst run defense in the NFL, they again struggle to run the ball that well. And then they come out against the Lions, and it's the best rushing performance, I think, of the season, or certainly felt that way. I know that the Tom Cable has said that the Carolina game was their best offensive line performance, but it certainly felt like the Lions game was a legitimately good running performance in a game that really mattered to both teams. Carolina, that was a funny game against Carolina. So while it's certainly possible, it's hard to sort of have too much faith that the Seahawks are going to just be able to go into Atlanta and do exactly the same thing again, because they haven't shown they're able to do that. This is a game where against Atlanta, I would say that the Falcons have probably got about a 65% chance of winning. They're at home. They have got an incredibly explosive offense. They are averaging 35 points a game at home. And I think for the Seahawks to have any chance, they're going to need to have the big plays in the game. So it'll probably be, either a turnover that leads to points, or a pick six, or a fumble recovery that leads to points, maybe a couple of big plays on special teams, and they will have to play error-free football. I think that is what it's going to take for the Seahawks to win this game on the road, because let's not forget, on the road this year, they have not been good. They are 1-4-1 against the NFC on the road, and that one win came against San Francisco by 2 points, a 2-14 team. So, yeah, I'm hopeful that the Seahawks can do what they did against Detroit, but I'm not overly confident that they will.
Being a draft guy as you are, and being a draft podcast as this normally is, we're going to look back at the 2014 NFL draft and a wide receiver class that had Sammy Watkins going first, Mike Evans, being the next wide receiver off the board, Odell Beckham going the third among the wide receivers, Brandon Cooks going fourth, Kelvin Benjamin going fifth. Then you get into the second round, which is Marquise Lee, Jordan Matthews, and Devontae Adams, Cody Latimer, Allen Robinson, Jarvis Landry. And right in the middle of that second round, you have Paul Richardson, who was taken ahead of Devontae Adams, ahead of Allen Robinson, ahead of Jarvis Landry, and, had these incredible plays at Colorado where you could totally see why he was the type of wide receiver that maybe you could build a passing game around. This was before Doug Baldwin became the Doug Baldwin that we know him as today. This was before the Seahawks traded for Jimmy Graham, before they drafted Tyler Lockett. Paul Richardson was meant to be the guy. So when you look at Paul Richardson, as a prospect, and Paul Richardson over the first 3 seasons of his career, which was, hampered by a torn ACL at the end of his rookie season, and then missing basically all of 2015 and injuring his hamstring, and then sort of becoming a 4th, 5th, 6th option on the offense this season, and now having to be forced into a role where, hey, we need you. We don't have Tyler Lockett. We don't have CJ Prosise in this game. What did you see from Paul Richardson? Do you think that you have something now with Paul Richardson with which to build on for next season? And more importantly, do you think that they have something with Paul Richardson to build on right now this weekend? Because it seems like that's something that they may need.
Well, in terms of this weekend, again, it's hard to predict because Paul Richardson has not had a big impact in Seattle. He had a really good game in the last game. But this has tended to happen with the Seahawks. You never quite know who's going to have the big game. And I think that if the Seahawks are going to have a big offensive performance in this one, the focus might be Jimmy Graham, purely because if people remember the Week 6 regular season game, they had real difficulty covering Jimmy Graham. It seemed like Seattle always had Jimmy Graham open over the middle because of the coverage that Atlanta used. They really didn't have much of an answer for it. And let's not forget that the Atlanta's scheme is very similar to Seattle's, and Seattle has had problem defending tight ends before. So I think that Graham is going to be the X factor if there is going to be one. But going back to Richardson, I remember him sort of covering him in the draft and sort of discounting him as a Seahawks option because he was so small. He I think was 175 pounds at the combine, and I think he was probably playing at about 165 at Colorado. I mean, he was tiny, very, very lean, way too skinny, you would have thought, for the NFL. And although I'd watched a few of his games and thought, yeah, really explosive, exciting player, I sort of discounted him a little bit because the Seahawks had traded for Percy Harvin, and it didn't seem like they would go for that type of guy again. And yet when they took him, it did make a degree of sense. I mean, they put him in the number 10 jersey, Kenny, which was Deshaun Jackson's number in Philadelphia. And 2014 was the year that Deshaun Jackson left Philadelphia and went to Washington. And Pete Carroll recruited Deshaun Jackson, was a big fan of Jackson's, and I think they would have loved to have him. And I think if they hadn't traded for Percy Harvin in 2013, it's probably quite likely that they would have made a move for Deshaun Jackson the following year. And it was only the fact they had Harvin that they didn't. And I think that the Richardson pick was probably an attempt by the Seahawks, especially because they gave him Jackson's jersey number, essentially to try and find a cheaper version, an affordable answer to Deshaun Jackson. I think that is what they were looking with Paul Richardson. But the problem is that he had one ACL injury in Colorado. He had an ACL injury pretty quickly into his Seahawks career. Then he has a hamstring injury. And sometimes it's the hamstring more than the knee that can hurt a player whose game is predominantly based on speed. Achilles injuries and hamstring injuries are horrible for players that are fast. And that may have just reduced some of his explosion and his quality that, perhaps they were looking to draft there. And yet in the last game, he was winning contested passes, which is not what you'd expect from a guy who is, 6 foot and about 180 pounds now, if that. And he was winning those contested passes. So it was a good sign to see him having a really good game against Detroit. But as I suggested earlier, I'm not going to hold out hope that he's suddenly going to be this incredible weapon for the Seahawks. And if we want one example of the way that you never quite know who's going to have an impact for the Seahawks, you just have to look at that 2014 Super Bowl when a guy who they'd not featured in the offense at any point during the season was virtually unstoppable for half of that game. And, had a touchdown, a couple of huge plays to give the Seahawks a chance to win that game. He could have been the Super Bowl MVP that year, a receiver that essentially up until that point had only was only known for getting the onside kick against the Packers in the previous game. So, Richardson, I think it's probably going to be, it's more likely to just be a one-off brilliant performance than a sign that he's suddenly going to become a really dynamic weapon. But fingers crossed that he is going to be that.
Well, speaking of dynamic weapons, I did mention CJ Prosise earlier when I was talking about players that they didn't have against the Lions. Obviously, CJ Prosise is a player that they haven't had for most of the season. He's played in 6 games, and half of those games was very limited. But when he was healthy, CJ Prosise was, rather incredible, averaging 5.7 yards per carry, catching 17 of 19 targets for 208 yards, 12.2 yards per reception, which is really good for, a wide receiver, 2 catches longer than 35 yards, a run of 72 yards, a really explosive player who, when he was really going and, able to get going against, the Bills or the Patriots and the Eagles, they won the game and they scored an average of, 30 points, 27 points, something like that, right in that area when CJ Prosise was healthy. The only loss coming against the Saints when he had 103 total yards, including 4 catches for 80 yards. And CJ Prosise, a converted wide receiver from Notre Dame, who he seems like he can be a dynamic player, but the injuries have held him back. And how much would you put on CJ Prosise? Because the Seahawks, they need to pull an upset. You go on the road. This is a team that has not had success on the road, that has definitely not had success against the NFC on the road, has not had success on the road in the playoffs under Pete Carroll pretty much whatsoever, with the exception of, the Washington Redskins and the Minnesota Vikings, both of whom were not very good division winners. The Seahawks need to have something that gives them, I think that they need to score 30 points. And if they can score 30 points, they'll win. To score 30 points, as bad as the Falcons' rush defense is, and the fact that they don't have Desmond Trufant, so they can win it, and the Seahawks will be relying on, Thomas Rawls. How much would you put it on CJ Prosise that says, man, if CJ Prosise is able to go, that's huge? Or if CJ Prosise is ready to go, he's a rookie, he hasn't played very much, it's probably not that big of a deal. What do you think?
I think it will be a big deal that he plays. I watched the Atlanta game again this week. And it was interesting how much the Seahawks featured CJ Spiller in the Week 6 game. I mean, he dropped, or was there were lots of drops from him. I want to say about 2 or 3 drops by CJ Spiller in that game when he was targeting the passing game. They tried to get a lot of shorter stuff, screens out to him. He would often split out wide, and they would throw him. So there was little bubble screens, wide receiver screens that I like to use. So I think that if there's something they've seen within this defense that they think, yeah, do you know what, that's what we need to target, then getting Prosise back is absolutely crucial, because they can line up as if they're going to run the ball, they can split him out wide, they can feel really confident throwing him the ball, and it might just help spread Atlanta out a little bit, and it might help them run the ball as well as they did last weekend. So I actually think that CJ Prosise could be an enormous factor for the Seahawks if they can get him healthy. But the big question is how healthy is he? If he just can't go, you can't play him. He has to be ready. And because he's only practiced 1 week, it kind of feels like, if he'd have practiced last week and they just played it safe for Detroit, and then he was practicing this week with the idea of coming back, you would feel much more confident about him going into this game. But the fact that he's only practicing this week makes it almost feel a bit like, you know what, season's on the line in this game, let's just give him a chance. And you're never quite sure how healthy he's going to be. And in that kind of a situation, the chances of somebody just coming back and instantly having the kind of game that he had against New England, for example, or the first half against Philadelphia, seems a little bit wishful thinking. So hopefully he is going to be healthy. And if he is, and he is, ready to have a big impact, then he can certainly do that. I think there's an opportunity for them to feature him a lot.
I feel like if I really wanted to, I could go back to 2013 and 2014 and 2015 and 2016 and say that, we consistently have this feeling, and that we consistently feel like that the next year is going to be the year that the offense really explodes. And I would say that I would say that last season the offense did explode. They were number 1 in DVOA. Russell Wilson was incredible. And you would have thought going into this year that it could only get to another level, but it took a step back, even though Wilson did, throw for more yards in a single season than anybody has. And he did it while he was injured for the franchise, and did it while he was injured, and Thomas Rawls was injured, and Christian Michael was sort of a necessary player to put back there, and Alex Collins didn't really, there were a lot of things going against them. But then I still can't help but look at it and say, man, next year, if we really wanted to, we could look at it and say, what if Russell Wilson had Thomas Rawls and CJ Prosise and Alex Collins? What if what if Russell Wilson had Jimmy Graham and Doug Baldwin and Tyler Lockett and Paul Richardson, and then you decide between Jermaine Kearse and Tanner McAvoy or whatever you want to do? What if he had, Nick Vannett and all these sort of things? And what if George Fant gets better? And what if? It's nice to think about what the possibilities could be, because the Seahawks have a lot of talented skill players, but in the past they've added Percy Harvin, they've added Jimmy Graham, they've added other players like Sidney Rice or Paul Richardson, and you would say like, oh man, they did it. They spent a second round pick on a guy. They traded for a guy. They signed a guy, and it never seems as good when it gets there as it did, 6 months earlier when you started to imagine that. What do you think in terms of how they focused their offense in 2017? Because it seems like this was the year that they focused the offense on channeling things through Russell Wilson, as opposed to channeling them through Marshawn Lynch. Obviously, the health of Thomas Rawls has a lot to do with that. And if he can get a full offseason and really come back next year healthy, then they sort of have a guy. I mean, when I was watching Rawls against the Lions, some of those runs, you're like, is that, if you squint your eyes, it's like, is that Lynch? Is that a guy? Because he never quits on a play. He always gets contact and then gets another 3 yards. And it's sort of, that's the way it feels to me. But how do you think you approach these offensive pieces next season? And with that, I'm kind of curious as well, how do you approach Jimmy Graham going into the final season of his contract?
I think it's very difficult to judge anything that they decided to do this year, because Russell Wilson got injured in week 1 of the season. I mean, it was the very first game against Miami when he hurt his ankle. And that completely, for me, the moment that happened completely changed the context of the season. Suddenly they were sort of spending the next few weeks trying to manage the offense around the fact the quarterback could barely move. Even in the week 6 game against Atlanta, when, if you remember back, that it feels like such a long time ago now. And it is 3 months ago, I guess. The hope around that time was, he's getting better. He's less restrictive, and Carroll and Wilson were being very positive about it. And yet, when you actually go and watch Wilson play in those games, you could see just how hurt he is and just how different he is compared to previous seasons. I mean, he couldn't move. So that really prevents you from judging anything that they wanted to do on this offense, because Wilson's probably like 500 rushing yards down on what he usually would be. You take away the read option, you take away the creativity that Wilson has to keep plays alive, to break off runs, to just even be a threat in game planning. I mean, teams are probably game planning the Seahawks thinking Wilson's not going to be able to move. I mean, so many teams have to plan to contain him within the pocket just as a priority. And yet they probably didn't have to do that anymore, and they could just target the offensive line. And this is the issue I have when people are very hard on the offensive line or on Tom Cable. It's that essentially, you're judging with so much adversity on an offense. Most other offenses would have collapsed in this situation. A quarterback with a high ankle sprain and an MCL sprain, an offensive line which is completely inexperienced. The most experienced player in his position this year was Gary Gilliam, and he was out the team for Bradley Sowell not so long ago. The running backs were injured. CJ Prosise has missed an awful lot of the year. Thomas Rawls has missed most of the year. Kristen Michael started the season, then they cut him. Alex Collins has never been consistent. When you actually consider all of those different things, how is it really possible to judge anything about this offense this year? So I'm not sure that they did go into this year thinking we want to focus Russell Wilson more, or we want to make Thomas Rawls this, that, the other. I don't think we really know what they wanted to do this year, because it's never been afforded the opportunity to happen. Going forward, I think that what the priority will be in the offseason is to make sure that the running game is, first and foremost improved. And that, I'm not sure how they're going to do that yet. Initially I thought it would be more O-line investment. Then I wondered whether or not it's going to be another running back coming in. And yet, the way that they're talking, it sounds like they're going to give this offensive line time to improve, and grow together. And that's something they're committed to now. And I believe them when they say that. I'm not convinced that they're going to go out and spend $10 million a year on Kevin Zeitler, for example. They may bring in a veteran option at right tackle. They may spend a high draft pick on the offensive line. They might spend draft picks on the offensive line to provide competition. But I don't think they're going to see it blown up and start again. At running back, there's going to be some options for them there. I'm sure they will add one at some point, whether that's free agency or at the draft. But I think that's what they're going to essentially want their focus to be. Run the ball, read option, creative point guard quarterback, dynamic weapons receiver with Jimmy Graham, Doug Baldwin. They might actually add another offensive passing option in the offseason. Recently I've been talking about David Njoku, who's a tight end in Miami, who could end up being a receiver at the next level because he's 6'4", 245 pounds, and he runs in the 4.4s. That's the type of player that the Seahawks generally really like or intrigued by. So, I could see something like that, but I do think that's what the focus will be. I think they want to be a running team. I think they want to be incredibly balanced. And I think they want to be explosive, and they want play action, and they want stuff like that. And they've not really had any opportunity to do that this year.
And what have you seen from Jimmy Graham in terms of that final, him going into the next year? Is that someone that you feel like, look, I think that when he gets that final year, you just let him play out this last year and take it from there? Or is it a guy that you think we should make sure that the Seahawks keep him around for 2 more years or 3 more years after this?
I think personally, I would, I'd be looking to give him 2 extra years on his contract. So I, sign a deal in the off season, which is a 3-year deal, but is essentially 2 more years on a similar amount of cap, I would suggest. I just think that, I know that people, it's been hot topic of debate ever since he arrived. A lot of people don't like the trade. They don't think the Seahawks use him properly. They don't think they're getting the value for money out of him because they don't use him properly. But ultimately, there's probably like about 4 guys like Jimmy Graham in the league. In fact, you could probably even narrow that down to sort of 2. I mean, there's Gronk and there's Jimmy Graham. There are other tight ends that are as productive as those guys are. Kelsey in Kansas City, Greg Olsen, Carolina. But there just aren't people like Gronk and Graham. They're not readily available. And you're better off having somebody like that than not. I mean, if you remove Jimmy Graham from the Seahawks, you're going to have to replace him. And there are not, loads and loads of tight ends coming out every year. It's a pretty good tight end draft this year, but then, in future years, it's probably not going to be as good as this one because we've had long droughts without any good tight ends in drafts for a long time. So I would do everything to keep him. I think that when Pete Carroll talks about him becoming the complete player, I think he's right. I don't mind seeing Jimmy Graham blocking when he's blocking as well as he is this year. And I think that the other thing is while people want to criticize the Seahawks' use of him, and this is often levied at Darrell Bevell, there's 2 things to consider here. First of all, if the Seahawks can't run the ball, it makes it much harder to use Jimmy Graham to the best of his abilities because if you haven't got 8 men in the box trying to stop the run, then they're able to sort of drop more people into coverage. So whether it's a linebacker or a safety helping out a slot corner or whatever, they can afford to give him more attention. So if the Seahawks can get back to running the ball really well next year, and get 8 men in the box, then Graham is going to have an incredible year. I've said it a few times in the comment section of the blog that if Jimmy Graham had a running game to work with in Seattle, then he would have had 12 touchdowns this year because of the extra attention that would have gone to trying to stop the run. And the other thing I would say is that I think Russell Wilson, perhaps we just need to sort of come to terms with the fact that he may never be a great red zone quarterback. I mean, the red zone issues are often placed at the door of Darrell Bevell. The Seahawks have not been a great red zone team for a while now, despite having players like Marshawn Lynch and Jimmy Graham. And when I'm watching the team and I see some of the concepts that they're using, I'm thinking there's not a lot wrong there. I think that Wilson is quite risk averse by nature. I think that Pete Carroll has preached that into him. I don't think he likes to take chances. I think when he looks at a formation that has 3 players covering Jimmy Graham, as the Lions had on one, the red zone plays against Detroit, the Lions put 3 guys on Jimmy Graham. They leave Jermaine Kearse 1v1, and Russell Wilson, because he trusts Kearse, is going to go there every time, and he often does. And then people go, why are they throwing to Kearse in the red zone? What's Bevell doing? And yet that's Wilson's judgment call. He gets to the line and am I going to throw into triple coverage to Jimmy Graham, or am I going to go for the 1v1 matchup? He goes for the 1v1. Now, there are certain ways they can work Graham around, get him in motion, maybe try and get him open or into lesser coverage, but a defense can still shift formation themselves and react to what he's doing. So it can be quite difficult just to magically go, right, we're going to get Jimmy Graham open. And again, I think this is a Russell Wilson issue more than anything because they have been consistently poor in the red zone during his career in Seattle. And I think it's just kind of one of those things they're going to have to live with until they can run the ball really well again. And they just haven't been able to do that this year.
The way you talk about Jimmy Graham and the importance of him on the offense and maybe getting him extended reminds me of the way that you talk about Cam Chancellor and the defense. And, his contract is going to have to be addressed this year in the offseason as well, and how important he is to the defense, and not someone that they're going to think about cutting, but someone that they need to think about how to keep around as an irreplaceable piece on the defense. That being said, he wasn't there for the last Falcons game. There's talk about how Earl Thomas won't be there this time and was there for the last Falcons game. Matt Ryan talking about, hey, look, we made plays when Thomas was in there. We think we can make plays when he's not in there, but, he's a great player. And he kind of also, in a way, seemed to allude to the fact that maybe the loss of Cam Chancellor is maybe even bigger than the loss of Earl Thomas when he wasn't there the last time. This time, they will have Cam Chancellor. They will have Frank Clark, who didn't play in the last game, and they will have Michael Bennett, who was hurt and left the game in the third quarter of the last game. So that's 3 pretty big pieces that the Seahawks get to add back in, even if they're losing Earl Thomas. How do you see the defense, because they are going up against the number 1 offense, the number 1 quarterback, the number 1, maybe wide receiver. They can do it all, and the Atlanta Falcons are at home in the Dome. How do you see Cam Chancellor, Frank Clark, and Michael Bennett having an effect on this game? Do you think that Steven Terrell can hold? Do you think that can hold the position and not be a liability? And do you think, like, what would be your biggest concern on the Seahawks defense in terms of where you think the Falcons are going to attack?
My biggest concern is it goes back to the Week 6 game, and there is this revisionist kind of history about that game that Atlanta didn't do anything for 3 quarters, and then in the third quarter it was all broken plays that led to scores. That's not really how it played out. I mean, Matt Ryan generally had a pretty good, consistent game in that one, and even the interception late on was on. It was on Julio Jones, funnily enough. I mean, he got his hands on the ball, tipped it in the air. Richard Sherman got a touch on it, and then Earl Thomas picked it off. So it was kind of fluky against Ryan in that regard. But he was pretty good. And what he was doing is he was play action a lot. He was running a play action and dropping quite a deep drop. And then at the top of his drop, he was very decisive. They were running underneath routes from play action. Now, when you do play action, usually it's with the idea of having a big explosive play downfield, or you want to take your shots downfield, and they will do that. But the one thing they were doing a lot in play action in this game was just throwing it 10, 15 yards from play action. So play action, suck up the linebackers into the run, a deep drop which avoided any kind of pressure getting towards Matt Ryan, and then throwing it underneath. And it's very easy for someone like Julio Jones to get open underneath because he's so quick off his break. So my concern for this game is exactly what we saw in that game, is that the Falcons will be able to do 10-yard pass, 15-yard pass, 8-yard pass, 10-yard pass, 15-yard pass, and before you know it, they're in the red zone, and the Seahawks haven't even laid a finger on Matt Ryan, have not been able to get the pass rush going, have not been able to get anywhere close to Julio Jones. And there's not really anything you can do about that. I mean, it's quite hard to defend. The only thing you can really hope for is that if they are just so poor running the ball that maybe against 4 defensive linemen, that maybe they can drop Bobby Wagner into coverage a lot more. But then if you're doing that, then you're not going to be able to blitz as much. And Seattle have kind of relied on the blitz to get pressure in recent games. So it's quite a difficult one to work out. That is my concern with Atlanta. That is why I think they have been so prolific this year. It is that it's nothing too spectacular. It's not 70-yard bombs. It's not Arizona Cardinals throwing it 40 yards, complex routes, beating, that require very technical routes that are being executed perfectly in an Arians offense that beats teams. That's not what they are. They are really pretty simple bootleg play action, throw it underneath, take what the defense gives you, and they just very slowly churn the scoreboard, and it just moves over, and they just find a way to get points on nearly every drive. And that's why they're 35 points a game at home. And I'm not sure how the Seahawks are going to stop that. I think the one positive thing, the big positive difference between this game and the last game, is going to be Cam Chancellor there, because that might just put a little thought into the mind of those receivers running across the middle that Cam's there, that they might get hammered, that they might get a big hit in a game like this. And it might just there may be some mental mistakes as a consequence of that. I think the best possible thing for the Seahawks is for Ryan to try an underneath pass in the first quarter and Cam Chancellor levels someone, because then that'll just, that'll send a message to Atlanta. That'll put it in the thought of those receivers. And this is not a physical, tough, beat you up type of team on offense or defense. So I think sending a message like that is absolutely vital, but it's easier said than done. You can't just scheme it so that Cam's going to be there and hit somebody. But I think that is going to be the key. I do think having him back is going to be a major plus. But of course, then you lose Earl Thomas, who was just flying all over the field in that other Atlanta game. Had a tremendous game, had the big interception. And there's no doubt that he's going to be a big loss.
We'll get to predictions for the game at the end of the podcast and sort of talk about, how we think it'll turn out. Let's quickly turn to a few other games going around. The Packers playing the Cowboys. Obviously, if the Seahawks can win this weekend on Saturday, then they can look ahead to that Cowboys-Packers game and actually root for the Packers to win and allow Seattle to come back home for the NFC Championship, setting up a rematch of the 2014 NFL season NFC Championship with that classic comeback in Seattle for them to come back and beat the Packers and advance to the Super Bowl. But if the Cowboys win, then Seattle, if they win, will be traveling to Dallas. And if Atlanta wins, they'll be traveling to Dallas in that case or hosting the Packers. So with that game, that Packers and Cowboys game, I think it really turns into the most interesting game of the weekend. People are going to be talking about Aaron Rodgers. They're going to be talking about the Cowboys' offensive line. It's rare that, an offensive line has taken center stage for a team, but really that is going to be considered if you wrap up the 2016 Dallas Cowboys. They're even with having a guy who led the NFL in rushing yards and a quarterback who perhaps put together the best rookie season by a quarterback in NFL history, a lot of that is going to be tied to the success of an offensive line with 3 all-pro players, and not perhaps enough credit given to the fact that these 2 guys played great and, did everything possible with this offensive line that wasn't constructed this season, that has been around for, 3 seasons and is able to come in and really elevate everything to the next level for them. But neither team necessarily having a great defense, neither team, necessarily having a great pass rush. Can Aaron Rodgers, is it going to be a duel between Aaron Rodgers and Dak Prescott? That seems like something that Aaron Rodgers would win. Is it going to be, the fact that is it going to be Ezekiel Elliott versus Ty Montgomery? Because obviously that seems like a matchup in the favor of the Dallas Cowboys. And then playing at home, I thought that the Packers would lose to the Giants last weekend, and I looked not so great on that call because I was very confident in the Giants to a certain degree, especially to the level that I didn't think that they would lose like that. And they did. They got their asses kicked as the game went on in the second half. That game was close up until, the Hail Mary at the end of the first half to really help to pull the score apart. And it just kept on going from there. Packers, Cowboys, do you think that the Packers are going to go into Dallas and sort of shock a rookie quarterback, a head coach without any playoff victories, Aaron Rodgers just advancing on to the next way? Or are we now underrating Dallas because we haven't seen them in a couple weeks?
Well, possibly because when the 2 teams met in the regular season in Green Bay, and it was a complete walkover for Dallas. Admittedly, the Green Bay have improved significantly since that day. I mean, that was right in the middle of the Green Bay slump, and what is it now? 7 wins in a row, or something like that, 6 or 7 wins in a row for them. So they're in really good form at the moment. I don't really know how to call this one. I mean, I personally felt very confident that Green Bay was going to win on Sunday. And I do think that Aaron Rodgers, he's making Green Bay look like the team to be in the whole playoffs. He's just in one of those stretches where you remember that he might be the best quarterback that's ever played the game. I mean, he's just so naturally sensational. I mean, and I know a lot of people don't like him, but you kind of do have to just sort of take your hat off sometimes and admire genius when you see it, and that's Aaron Rodgers. And the way that he scrambled in the pocket and one of the touchdown throws, where he looked like Justin Timberlake, the way he was like dancing around in the pocket, avoiding defensive linemen, and then to have the poise to throw an absolute perfect dart to the left corner of the end zone to get a touchdown. I mean, people want to focus on the Hail Mary, but focus on that. I mean, that's just incredible. The kind of movement he showed in the pocket there, and the poise and the accuracy under pressure. And I could easily see a situation where he goes into Dallas, in a dome, not the most threatening home field advantage, and just throws 4 touchdowns, and Green Bay just go marching on. And regardless of what Dallas does, they're just going to be beaten by Aaron Rodgers. Could definitely see that. But then that would be, it would be offensive to Dallas to just write them off. Given the way that they've played. I mean, the balance that they show on offense, the way that Zeke Elliott runs the ball, the way that they wear teams down because of the running game, the creativity of Dak Prescott, the defense that has punched above its weight all year, which is very, very well coached. I think it has all the makings of a classic game, a real classic. I would probably give the edge to Rodgers just because of the way he's playing right now. But there's absolutely no way that I would count out Dallas in this game, and it really could go either way. Could be down to who has the ball last.
Yeah, I will give the edge to Dallas. I would say that I'm picking the Cowboys, but probably go on the opposite spectrum as well and just say, of course, I could see why Aaron Rodgers and the Packers could definitely win this game. It's a very close one to call. I'm just going to go with the home team, and I think something tells me maybe Byron Jones makes a big play here, something like that. I do worry like Dallas has their leading sack getter is Benson Mayowa, who couldn't even really get much time with the Seahawks, and has bounced around a little bit a couple times since then, and that's their leading pass rusher right now. Into the AFC.
Can I ask you a question, Kenny? Would you rather let me paint this little scenario for you? Would you rather face Green Bay in the NFL? If let's just say Seattle wins against Atlanta, would you rather play Green Bay in Seattle, knowing that Green Bay would be coming off an 8-game winning streak with Aaron Rodgers playing the way that he is, or would you rather go to Dallas knowing that all they will have done is just won one game at home against Green Bay, having not had any real momentum coming into the playoffs? Is it as easy as just any kind of home game is best, or if Aaron Rodgers goes to Dallas and beats the number 1 seed, are you wary at all of facing him in Seattle?
I think that there are two very key. I mean, if I were to have the two most key points to make for Dallas and Green Bay, which one to face, both would be in favor of facing Dallas, or because I think that facing Packers at home, I still believe you're facing the worst of the two teams at home, as opposed to going on the road against the better of the two teams. Dallas finished second in DVOA, then the Packers finished 7th in DVOA. The Cowboys finished 3rd on offense. The Packers finished 4th on offense. The Cowboys finished 17th on defense. The Packers finished 20th on defense. The Cowboys finished 10th in special teams. The Packers finished 20th in special teams. Everything except for Aaron Rodgers points to Dallas being the better team. And the difference between Aaron Rodgers and, not just Aaron Rodgers and Dak Prescott, the difference between Aaron Rodgers and everything else that they've got on offense is not even is at least as good as Dak Prescott and Ezekiel Elliott and Dez Bryant and Jason Witten and Travis Frederick and Nick Martin or Zach Martin and Tyron Smith, and everything to me points to the Cowboys being the better team. So I don't think that momentum is real. I don't think that going into an 8-game winning streak matters to me at all. It's over the course of 16 games, the Cowboys were 3 games better than the Packers. Over the course of the whole season, they were better. Having a little bit of a winning streaks are just going to be broken. Who had more momentum in NFL history than the 18-0 Patriots going up against the 11-7 or 12-7 Giants in 2011? There is nothing too momentous about momentum for me. So in all cases, give me the Packers at home for sure. And I think that if the Seahawks defense, the biggest difference being how much different the pass defense is without Earl Thomas, any great pass defense has been proven in the Seahawks playoffs time and time again under Pete Carroll is mitigated. It is totally mitigated. You have to have something besides a quarterback to beat the Seahawks when they're on their game. Maybe that's different without Earl Thomas, but you look at Aaron Rodgers in the NFC Championship. You look at Peyton Manning in the Super Bowl. You look at Drew Brees in 2010. You look at Robert Griffin III in 2012. Everything, even the games that the Seahawks have lost against Matt Ryan or Cam Newton or Tom Brady, they've done a great job on those quarterbacks. Those teams just had more to give than just a quarterback, and I don't think the Packers do have more to give. I take it you would rather face the Cowboys.
No, I'd rather face Green Bay just because it's at home, and I would always take the Seahawks at home over a road game, just because there's something special about CenturyLink Field. And I think that would be a benefit to them. However, I don't think it's a complete home run that it would be the best thing. I mean, if they were to play both games, for example, I could imagine a scenario where a Green Bay team wins in Seattle and a Seattle team wins in Dallas. I just think that there's a reason why no rookie quarterback has ever won the Super Bowl. Dallas are quite still a young team. Seattle defends the run particularly well. I don't think Dallas's defense is that good. I think it's overachieved. But the Seahawks exploit that, possibly. And plus, the other thing is the Packers beat the Seahawks 38-10 just a few weeks ago. And while I wouldn't expect a complete repeat of that, it's the first time the Seahawks have been hammered by anybody in 5 years. And, the idea of having to face that team again or choosing to face that team again so soon afterwards gives you a little bit of pause for thought. That said, I will always take the home game. If you said to me, Kenny, Seahawks have won, we're doing this podcast after the Atlanta game, for example, and we're reacting to it. If the Seahawks have won the game, if you're saying to me, who do you want? I'm saying I'm rooting for Green Bay because I want that championship game in Seattle next week. The Seahawks have never lost an NFC championship game at home. Let's see if they can do it again.
The other thing about facing a team like Dallas, and another thing that you have confidence in facing a team like Atlanta is the Seahawks still have, with or without Earl Thomas, they still have an elite run defense. They have one of the best run defenses in the NFL, and it's something that almost works against them against a team like the Lions, because the Lions can't run the ball anyway. The Packers can't run the ball anyway. If they face one of these teams that can't run the ball, then it's not going to matter. But this was the number 2 team in DVOA against the run. I believe it's still the best defense alive in the playoffs right now. They were only behind Denver, New York, Arizona, and Philadelphia overall. And then after that, you've got Baltimore, Houston, San Diego, Minnesota, Carolina. They're the only team in the top 10 of defense, besides the Texans, who don't really count, that's still alive for the Super Bowl. And so I think that's a huge advantage for the Seahawks that we sort of overlook. So if you're going up against a team like the Dallas Cowboys, who have so much going for Ezekiel Elliott, it'll be this great gladiator match between the Seahawks front 7 and the Dallas, offensive line, because I would still say in a lot of those cases, when you've got the better run defense, bet on the defense, because how many times, Rob, in the last 5 years can you recall the Seahawks really getting destroyed by a running back? It happens, but it's pretty rare. And when you look at Ezekiel Elliott's season, his worst game of the season was back in week 1 against the New York Giants. He ran 20 times for 51 yards. They lost the game 20-19. Since then, he hasn't rushed for fewer than 80 yards in a game. That's pretty freaking insane. In the last 14 games, he didn't rush for fewer than 4 yards per carry. One time against the Baltimore Ravens, he had 3.88. Every single game, he goes out there and he's usually putting up 95, 100, 130 rushing yards. He's a little bit of a pass catcher. He had 15 touchdowns. He led the NFL in rushing yards. But if you take that away from the Dallas Cowboys, if they're able to mitigate that with, Frank Clark and Michael Bennett and Tony McDaniel and Atiba Rubin and Jaron Reed and Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright and Mike Morgan, these are guys that specifically designed, a lot of them, to stop the run. Take that away from them, force Dak Prescott to be the guy to move the ball down the field, perhaps pressure Dak Prescott, perhaps put him into a bad situation. Those are the types of things that you would like to see from a rookie quarterback. This week they're facing Devonta Freeman and Tevin Coleman, and Freeman and Coleman were totally taken out of the game in their first matchup. What I had said earlier, can you imagine a running back, whether it's Ezekiel Elliott or anyone, getting the best of the Seahawks defense, or do you think that they are able to overcome that? And how do you think that do you have any fears about Devonta Freeman?
I don't fear Freeman. I do sort of fear the Arizona offense in general. But I kind of, it's not so much a defined fear of what he can do so much as it is if they get the passing game going, could you imagine things spiraling out of control a little bit? And I could definitely imagine that. The problem is that the Seahawks, we know who the Seahawks are now. We know that they are very capable of winning anywhere, as they showed in New England. They're also very capable of suddenly finding themselves in a huge hole in big road games. So we saw it with Green Bay. We saw it kind of a little bit with Tampa Bay. You think back to the Carolina game last year when there was, blown away in the first half. You think to the last Arizona game when they were 20-0 down at half time. And my fear is that if, I can just imagine, I can picture it now, Kenny. I can almost feel it happening, 2 or 3 days early. And that's, an opening drive that goes for 7 or 8 plays and a touchdown. I mean, how many times have teams just been like a hot knife through butter against the Seahawks defense on their opening drive? It has happened in games in which they won. And my fear is that if it gets to 14 or 10-0 or, 17 or whatever, that suddenly someone like Devonta Freeman is going to have a really big game. I think it's absolutely crucial that the Seahawks stay within touch early of this game. They have to start better than they did in the divisional round last year. They have to. They have to start better than they did in Atlanta last year. They've got to be within touching distance. This has to be a New England type of game where, maybe if New England do score early, the Seahawks fight back and get a field goal or a touchdown themselves, and they chip away, they get in front, they go in at halftime with a lead or trailing by just 3 points or level, and then gradually they start to take control, and then they put Atlanta in a position like New England were, where they've got to go and chase the game, they've got to go and try and get back into it. That is how this game is going to have to play out. And if Atlanta get a big lead, then I could see Freeman, I can see Coleman getting those big chunk plays, frustrating the Seahawks, sort of putting the final knife through the heart of their season. So I think hopefully, fingers crossed, especially if ProSize is there, they can make this a bit of a New England type game. But I don't know. And I don't, just one final point on this, I don't see Atlanta doing this. I mean, like David Johnson's had a couple of decent games against Seattle for Arizona. But if you actually look at his yards per carry, it was 3.4 yards per carry in Seattle and 3.4 yards per carry in Arizona. So he ran the ball 33 and 28 times. It felt like he had a really big day, but actually the yardage was pretty small. So I don't fear, any kind of big name running back having a great day against Seattle. What I do kind of fear is those teams getting into a position where they can run the ball a lot and get 100 yards, albeit in a sort of a 3.5 yards per carry situation. But if any team is running 30 times against the Seahawks, that means it's bad news for Seattle. They need their guys, they need their opponents running back running 12 times, 15 times max, which means that they've forced them to throw the ball a lot more. And if they can do that, and if Freeman and Coleman get, a few carries between them as opposed to one of them getting 20 and one of them getting 10, then there's a pretty good chance they're in the game and with a chance to win it.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pull up a number here, which I'm working on as we speak. But imagine, like, the way that I talk about, what Ezekiel Elliott has been doing against defenses this year, or when you see the way Marshawn Lynch did it during, his time in the NFL. But, that sort of frustration that an offense, that a fan base or a defensive coordinator has to feel when he's playing a game, and it's like to keep seeing someone pick up first down on the ground, first down on the ground, first down on the ground, touchdown, long touchdown run, all these things. It's so super rare to see that from the Seahawks perspective. It's not something that has happened against the Seahawks very often, and it's something that maybe we take for granted because we focus so much on the passing game. But I mean, really, in the last few years, how many of these running backs have had phenomenal yards per attempt? I pulled it up on the opposite. How many guys do you think have rushed for more than 4.5 yards per carry against the Seattle Seahawks? From what I can tell, you've got Adrian Peterson in 2012. He rushed for 182 yards on 17 carries. Jamal Charles in 2014. Mike James, the surprising Bucks guy who rushed for 158 yards in 2013. DeMarco Murray in 2011. Zach Stacy in 2013. Frank Gore in 2012 and 2013. But in terms of this season, you have Jonathan Stewart, who had 11 carries for 50 yards. So that was a part-time role. And Carlos Hyde, who had 21 carries for 103 yards and 4.9 yards per carry with 2 touchdowns. But all of that came in garbage time. There's really not – that was the only examples in 2016 of any running back or any player having at least 10 carries against the Seahawks and more than 4.5 yards per carry. and no running back against the Seahawks this season had more than 5 yards per carry. Last season, there was only 2 guys that did that, Giovanni Bernard and James Stark. Neither one of them had remarkable games, 80 yards for Bernard, 95 for Starks. You have to go back to 2014 when Jamal Charles had the 20 carries for 159 yards in a win over the Seahawks. So in the last 2 seasons, they've only had 4 guys average more than 4.5 yards per carry against them with any significant yardage. And really, if you pump that above to like 15, or to a guy that had at least 100 yards. The only guy is Carlos Hyde, and it all came in garbage time. This run defense is phenomenally good, and we underrate it. And Jarran Reed, what are your thoughts on Jarran Reed's rookie season? Because now we've wrapped up Reed's rookie season from a regular season standpoint. We've got one against the Lions. Is in terms of something that we don't really talk about or understand anymore, which is the run-stopping defensive tackle. How do you think Jarran Reed did for a rookie, and how do you think that he can transform? Because every rookie should have a year 2 through 5 that you would think looks better. Or do you think this is the Jarran Reed we expected, this is the Jarran Reed we got, this is the Jarran Reed we're going to have for the next few years?
Yeah, I know that there's probably going to be some internal hope that Jarran Reed can, take another step forward. But Jarran Reed at Alabama was a run stopper. He was the kind of guy that could plant his legs, had big tree trunk legs, he could plant his feet, and, he could absorb a couple of blockers, and he could keep the linebackers clean. And I think we've seen a lot of that this year. How often, I don't think it's a coincidence that Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright have been so formidable, especially when blitzing up the middle, when Jarran Reed has been on part of this team, because he does do a very good job of just sort of soaking up the blocks and taking them. And he was never going to be, I don't think, this kind of quick twitch, explosive pass rusher who could live in the backfield. I think he is what he is, essentially. What can he do going forward? I just think it's a case of that there will be little things in terms of his technique that he can work on. He may be able to become a little bit quicker, perhaps, to provide a little bit more of a pass rushing angle. But I think what he has to be a really, really stout, physical, tough guy up the middle who is never going to get the kind of praise and attention that, other defensive tackles get. But that's kind of what his role has to be. Seattle has preached gap discipline for so long. One of the main reasons why the Seahawks can defend the run so well is their gap discipline is so technically sound. And while there are some other players in the league who are maybe more disruptive than Seattle's defensive tackles, they probably also give up a lot more in the run game because they're probably winging it a little bit more. They're probably trying to find ways and be creative to get into the backfield, whereas Seattle's guys, they're just, this is my job, I'm going to do it, I'm going to execute, and it's going to stop them running the ball. And, that sometimes does hurt the pass rush because there's not really an interior push up there, but it does help them in the run game. And I think that's Seattle's priority. And I think Jarran Reed has done a good job there. Of course, you always want more from these guys. He was such a big name. He was, a player that was talked about as a potential first-round pick. But that doesn't mean the great pass rushers just because they're being talked about in the first round. And the reason why Jarran Reed ultimately fell is because this is who he is. Teams are not clearly were not willing to spend a first-round pick on somebody who was just incredibly disciplined and tough and physical in the run game, who could keep the linebackers clean. They clearly wanted a bit more than that with their first-round picks, which is why he fell. The Seahawks have got this guy now, but he is what he is. And if the Seahawks want more of a pass rusher up the middle, they're going to have to go and find that guy in either free agency or in the draft this year.
And so getting on to the AFC really quick, I don't think we have to spend a ton of time on the Patriots and Texans. Anything that you would be looking for in particular? The Texans lost 27-0 while playing against Jacoby Brissett in their match against Patriots earlier in the year. They've got the worst quarterback starting in the NFL. They do have Jadeveon Clowney. I mean, there's plenty of things to look forward to next season for Houston if they can find a way to fix that quarterback. But are we turning off this game in the first quarter?
Maybe not the first quarter, but sort of halfway through the second, it might be time to. It's going to be on at 1 o'clock in the morning here in the UK. So I know that a lot of people will be celebrating that fact, Kenny, because it means we can all go to bed instead of watching it. the Seahawks game's on, I think, about 9:30, and then this one comes on straight after. So I will be probably probably writing something after the Seahawks game, keeping half an eye on it, and then I'm going to go to bed. It's going to be exactly what people think. I mean, when the Texans went up there early in the season, they had Jacoby Brissett as quarterback, and they got shut out. Close. I do not see any way Houston will make this competitive. It's going to be a cakewalk, I suspect, for Houston, as long as they can keep Jadeveon Clowney somewhat in control. I mean, I don't think you can completely stop him the way he's playing at the moment, but I would expect Bill Belichick and Tom Brady and Josh McDaniels to have some kind of a plan to combat him. I think the only way that the Patriots risk losing this game is if they just have a horrendous off night, turn the ball over, and Houston somehow find a way to just run and play the percentages. Teams have gone into New England and won in the past. Like Baltimore have won there a couple of times, running the ball well, having a bit of special teams luck, maybe a big special teams play, kick return or a fumble or something like that. If they can keep it close, then that bit of luck can help them out. But Houston keeping this one close just seems like such a stretch. But stranger things have happened.
I think one of the things that I keep coming back to that surprises me somewhat is every time I think about the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, or every time I think about the Chiefs, even in this upcoming playoff game against the Steelers, I just get bored immediately, and I just want to take a nap. And I just don't have anything about Kansas City that excites me or thinks that they are really a great team. They were 6th in DVOA, but they were 13th on offense and 14th on defense. They're a really good special teams team. They don't have the defense there right now. Their offense is totally boring. And you look at Pittsburgh and you say Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown. I'm all in with these two guys, and obviously Ben Roethlisberger is a future Hall of Fame quarterback, and right there, especially if he can get a 3rd Super Bowl ring. It's all right there for Pittsburgh, and they even have a few defensive players that you can like and everything like that. Do you have a lot of faith in Kansas City? Am I alone on this one?
No, not at all. I'm totally agree with you. I totally agree with your assessment of the team as well. I mean, Alex Smith is he's that guy that he will not cost you many games. He will not lose you many games. He probably doesn't win you many games, but if you've got a good supporting cast, then he'll get you home and get you across the finish line. But when it gets to playoff time, you notice the fact that Alex Smith is the quarterback. And the Chiefs might win this game, Kenny, but they'll just go to New England next week and get thrashed. So, I'd rather see New England play Pittsburgh next week because I just think it's a better game. When I look at the Chiefs and what they've done this year, this is a Chiefs team that scraped to wins against teams like the Chargers, for example, and the Saints at home. They squeezed past the Jaguars at home. They squeezed past the Panthers with an incredible amount of fortune at the end of that game. But then they've had some impressive wins as well. I mean, they beat the Raiders twice with Derek Carr. They went to Atlanta and won. They beat the Atlanta Falcons by a point. The Seahawks might be watching that game this week to see if they can get any tips. But then they also lost to the Titans at home, and really. And when the last time the Steelers played the Chiefs, it was in Week 4, and it finished 43-14 to Pittsburgh. It was an absolute blowout. You're never quite sure what you're going to get from Kansas City. I mean, if you remember in the playoffs last year, didn't Kansas City beat Houston 30-0 or something and then just go and get destroyed by New England? That's kind of what you're going to get from this Chiefs team. They are pretty boring. Pittsburgh, they've got 3 fantastic players on offense and not a great deal else. The defense, I don't think is that great. It's played well recently, but I don't think it's great. It's just really, if Le'Veon Bell runs the ball, if Big Ben avoids the mistakes that he kind of has every now and again, and if Antonio Brown plays well, then you would probably expect the Steelers to win this game. If the Chiefs win, it won't be a surprise. I think either team is just setting themselves up for a loss in New England the following week anyway.
We'll get back to the Seahawks prediction later in the show to wrap things up, but quickly moving over to college football. I feel like a real flip in expectations here as Alabama was heavily favored to repeat the national championship with a win over Clemson. Clemson coming back a year later to get into the national championship with some redemption on the line, Deshaun Watson getting some redemption, and really coming out of that game saying, Clemson wins 35-31. They pull off the come-from-behind win. They put up 35 points on the best defense in the nation. Deshaun Watson, going from being a guy before the game who was talking about a second-round pick or a third-round pick, and maybe that's what he'll still ultimately prove to be, but really going into the draft now on the highest of peaks and really being able to go into the draft saying, I just went to 2 straight national championships. I won one of them. I went up against the best defense in the nation, which has 5 or 6 or 8 future NFL players on it. And now look at me as a piece of the future of a franchise because I've proven myself on the biggest possible stage. I looked great. 36 of 56 for 420 yards, 3 touchdowns, rushed for another touchdown, going up against Alabama. How did you did your feelings about Deshaun Watson change after this game, and should they change?
I think the only time that my opinion changed is that I kind of, I don't think we've ever really talked about him this year. I kind of went into the year thinking he was going to be a top 5 pick. I moved him down in the mock draft just because that's what the vibe was from people in the NFL, like John Clayton and Adam Schefter and people talking about this quarterback class. Speak to people in the NFL, they were talking about the who could go first and Mitch Trubisky rising and stuff like that. I don't really understand what the issue is with Deshaun Watson. I mean, like, quarterbacks come into the league every year, Kenny, and teams ultimately make a decision on them. And last year, teams made a decision that Carson Wentz and Jared Goff, although they weren't the best 2 players in the draft, were so worth having that 2 teams were willing to, spend everything, the life savings to get these guys. The Rams and the Eagles giving up multiple first-round picks, multiple picks overall to go and get these guys. And you kind of think, okay, well, they wanted a quarterback badly. They believe in these players, so fair enough. And yet there's so little buzz about somebody like Deshaun Watson to the point where people are suggesting he could go in the second round. And that's what I don't understand. How do you get Jared Goff being worth 2 first-round picks plus change? And how do you get Deshaun Watson being talked about as a second-round pick? I just don't get that. Because you watch Jared Goff and you think, yeah, okay, throw some pretty passes and you can kind of see the production there and you can see there are some things to like. But then here's this game with 5 interceptions against Utah. Here's this game where he throws 2 interceptions, but the really important interceptions, and California loses the game. Here's a Cal team that has never been elevated even within the Pac-12, let alone on a national level, by the presence of Jared Goff as the starter for the last 3 years. He's not a particularly improvisational quarterback. He has to work within the framework of a system. His system was Sonny Dykes' extreme spread offense, which doesn't really translate to the NFL. There are so many things about Goff that you could list as reasons not to draft him in the first round, let alone to spend 2 first-round picks to go and get him. And then you look at Deshaun Watson and you say, okay, what's he done for 3 years? He's won football games. What's his production like? It's elite. He's won a national championship. He's not just played well against Alabama's fantastic defense once in a title game. He's done it twice. He played really well a year ago and very nearly won the game in that game. He did win the game this time, playing against the best of the best in college football. He just looks so incredibly poised in the championship game this year. He was ice cold leading that game-winning drive. I mean, you would never imagine that was like, less than a minute to go. Everything's on the line here, and yet he goes and wins them the game. Prototype size, great mobility, great improvisational player, decent arm strength. No one's going to complain about that. Has he made mistakes this year? Yeah, he did. He's thrown some horrible interceptions, Kenny. He had 17 interceptions this year. It's something you're going to have to work on. He also threw 41 touchdowns. His touchdown to interception ratio in his college career is 90 odd to 30 odd. It's 3-1. If I'm the Chicago Bears, or if I'm the San Francisco 49ers, or if I'm the Cleveland Browns or the New York Jets, and I'm looking at this draft class and I'm thinking, right, I need a quarterback. Who's coming out next year? Who's coming out this year? And I'm saying, well, we could wait for Sam Darnold at USC, but who knows how he's going to develop. He turns the ball over a lot as well. Or we could just go and take Deshaun Watson. And I'm taking Deshaun Watson, and I'm building around him, and I'm making him, because he can be the face of a franchise, got incredible character, humility. He's a star. For me, I think a star in the making. And do you know what? He might come into the league and might be completely useless and might not work out. It might be one of those quarterbacks who's never any good. Or he might be Ryan Tannehill or Andy Dalton or somebody like that. If I need a quarterback, I'm still taking a chance on this guy. Because you have to. That's the NFL. You have to have a quarterback. You have to have somebody who can just sort of lead your offense. And Watson has proven that he can do that at Clemson. And I think that somebody has to take a chance on this guy early in the top 10. Because if they don't, what are you waiting for? Are you waiting for Andrew Luck to come out again? Are you waiting for, another Marcus Mariota? What are you waiting for? What's so much worse in Deshaun Watson's game that we didn't see in Jameis Winston's game? He was the number 1 overall pick. Jameis Winston turned the ball over an awful lot. Jameis Winston won a national championship, but then got to the playoffs the following year and got booted out by Oregon in the semifinals. What is the main? And he had all the character issues, Jameis Winston. Deshaun Watson doesn't have any of them. What is the main difference between the two? And, I don't really understand some of the criticism of Deshaun Watson. And I think for me personally, Kenny, if I'm Chicago or somebody like that, I'm seriously thinking of taking him in the top 10.
Well, I know that when we talked about Mike Williams on this podcast, you weren't too high on Mike Williams being an elite receiving prospect, and him coming off a national championship and him becoming one of the stars in this game as well. Some people did have him in the top 10. What about Mike Williams? Is that a guy that you can get behind as a receiver?
Not in the top 10. I think that's too rich, especially with the players that are in this draft class. You're just looking at Solomon Thomas, by the way. He's just going to be an absolute monster at the combine. He's going to probably go in the top. I mean, the way that he played against North Carolina, I've done a bit more research on him this week. He's going to go in the top. He's going to go in the top 8. He might go in the top 5. When I do my next mock draft, I'm going to put him at Jacksonville at number 4. When you've got players like that, and Leonard Fournette and Dalvin Cook, Jabril Peppers, the safeties, Jonathan Allen, Tim Williams, there are just so many great players that are in this class. And because of that, I have a hard time putting Mike Williams in the top 10. I think if anybody takes Mike Williams in the top 10, they will be forcing a receiver need that I don't necessarily think they have to make, especially with some of the options in free agency. There's going to be Alshon Jeffrey in the free agency, Pierre Garçon. You're going to have sort of options in round 2 as well. You might be able to trade back into the first round and take someone like John Ross or Corey Davis or Juju Smith-Schuster. There are players there you could target a bit later on. So at the moment, I've watched a bit more of Williams. I think that his kind of play has been a bit inconsistent at times. There are some games where he doesn't really do anything. There are other games where he's been an absolute beast and taking the game over. He had some nice plays against Alabama. He had quiet stretches as well. I'm kind of projecting him in the middle of the first round to someone like Philadelphia, who've been looking for a big target pretty much since Doug Peterson took over. So, I think that they're going to be looking for that type of player, and I think that's kind of the range he's probably going to go in, sort of that middle of the first round.
I want to hit on the NFL again with some of these coaching hires. The Denver Broncos hiring Vance Joseph, the Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator, for just one season. They bring him in to be their next head coach and sort of, I think, pretty much keep things the same and hopefully, find the right guys. They hired offensive coordinator Mike McCoy after he was fired by the San Diego Chargers, so they can have Mike McCoy come in and hopefully get that offense back to where it needs to be in order to get back to the playoffs, because the defense is still there, but the offense lacked even as bad as the quarterbacks were last year for Denver, lacked what they needed to become a playoff team again in defense of a Super Bowl. So they hire Vance Joseph, and then the Buffalo Bills hire Sean McDermott, the defensive coordinator from Carolina. Interestingly, both of the coordinators that were hired to be head coaches today come from defense, and both come from defenses that ranked in the bottom 7 of defense this season. So it wasn't based on any sort of, and not necessarily that you should be hiring coaches just based on pure production, or, there's a bigger body of work and a more human side to it. Just interesting that teams haven't so far focused on the guys that just are coming off the best seasons. But perhaps, and McDermott has a lot more experience than Vance. He's been around. He's been a defensive coordinator for the last 8 years, which is really long for anyone to be a coordinator. And now he gets to be the Bills head coach. It's not going to be Chris Richard, who interviewed with the Buffalo Bills. They're going with McDermott, and some more coordinator stuff goes around. A lot of people wondering where Wade Phillips will end up. If Wade Phillips ends up somewhere, the defensive coordinator, and Bill Musgrave, an offensive coordinator. Any thoughts right now on the state of the Bills and the Broncos and what it means for the 49ers and Rams in their head coaching searches?
Well, I think a couple of things, Kenny. First of all, it shows that there's a real dearth of options at the moment. There's not a great list of quality candidates out there. A lot of younger guys, a lot of guys who you kind of, teams are taking a chance on here. I think that's exactly what is happening with the Broncos. They interviewed Vance Joseph before. I think that they liked him. They like his demeanor and his personality, and obviously feel like they want to give him a shot. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not like they've gone with him over an abundance of more attractive options. And being a head coach sometimes it's not really about, well, this guy didn't have a great unit in Miami. I think for the last sort of few weeks, Miami have been playing with 6 of their defensive starters injured. So if you take that many players out of a starting unit, you're going to struggle a little bit. I think there were stretches this year when Vance Joseph looked and Miami's defense looked pretty good. So that's a quick thought on that. I mean, the other thing I would say is that I think it's a review of the way teams are not prepared to wait too long. So I think if Atlanta had not made the playoffs, or if they had and they were beaten last week, I think it's absolutely guaranteed that Kyle Shanahan would be a head coach somewhere. But because teams have to wait to interview him, and because there's a chance that Atlanta will progress again, and then they won't be able to appoint him for another week. And if they make the Super Bowl, you're looking at, like 2-3 weeks down the line till you can appoint your head coach. I don't think teams are willing to wait that long, because the best staff, you mentioned some of the names there. Where's Wade Phillips going to be? Where's Musgrave going to be? Where's Mike McCoy going to be? These guys are going to get appointed very, very quickly now. You're going to see them come off the market. And if you are waiting for somebody like Kyle Shanahan or Josh McDaniels or, Chris Richard or Tom Cable or whoever, because they're in the thick of the playoffs, then you run the risk of missing out on the best staff. And it is a cumulative staff that you're bringing together here. It's about, I think they're looking to take Mike McCoy back to Denver because they feel like they want an experienced defensive mind to go with Vance Joseph, who's more defensive minded. That makes a lot of sense. If they were sort of waiting on Kyle Shanahan, then they might miss out on him and Mike McCoy. So I think that's what's at play here. We're seeing teams sort of looking at the options that they can appoint now, looking to try and get a move on it, trying to get half a step on other teams in terms of coordinators, and I think that's what's happening now. I think Vance Joseph's probably got the ideal situation because he goes into a Denver team that is pretty good, that can, just a year removed from winning a Super Bowl with Brock Osweiler and a very, very old Peyton Manning at quarterbacks. That's a good situation for him. Sean McDermott's got into a situation at Buffalo where I do not, I kind of envy him because I quite like to be an NFL head coach and earn the money that they do. But I don't envy him in terms of the challenge of trying to get Buffalo moving. This is a team that just doesn't really seem to know what it wants to be. They've lurched from, Doug Marrone to Rex Ryan to Now Sean McDermott, they keep jumping between a 4-3 defense and a 3-4, now back to a 4-3. They get Tyrod Taylor, they give him a big contract. Now it looks like they're going to cut him and go in a different direction. It's a very difficult job, and of course, if you're in that division, you've got to knock off the Patriots somehow. Getting into the playoffs, you're kind of relying on the wild card there because of the presence of Brady and Belichick in that division. So it's a very difficult job. So I think he might find it a challenge.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you talk about the implications of winning and losing as it relates to head coaches and searches and this kind of thing, because I believe Tom Cable is supposed to interview with the 49ers about their head coaching position on Sunday after the game, in the way that Chris Richard interviewed with the Bills last Sunday. And when you think about Kyle Shanahan, it's like how Adam Gase was in Denver, and if they went to the Super Bowl, he wasn't really available for, interviews. I mean, he could have had them, or he did have them, and it's like you've got to try. You can't abandon the mission that you've been on for all year to win this Super Bowl. And when you're looking at Shanahan, what he's managed to do in his second season with the Falcons is really incredible, and how they spread out the whole game plan. And, that's one of the most interesting things about researching the Falcons, is that you might expect it to be like, well, a team that has this many passing yards and touchdowns would have, so much of it funneled through 2 or 3 options. And you'd think, okay, well, I know they have Julio Jones and he's great, so it must be that they have another guy or 4 that really, also have, 1,000 yards. And it's not the case at all. Julio Jones, for one, only has 6 touchdowns. No other player on the team has 700 receiving yards, even though Matt Ryan had just under 5,000 passing yards and 38 touchdowns. I mean, it's because they've got 462 yards to Freeman, 421 to Coleman, 579 to Taylor Gabriel, 653 to Mohamed Sanu, 323 to Aldrick Robinson, 271 to Austin Hooper. I mean, it just continuously passes it around. They've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 guys who have caught at least 2 touchdown passes. It's a great job of orchestrating an offense, and maybe even, becoming like, with being the son of a head coach with so much experience, trying to take that thing to the evolution to the next level, and continually trying to do new things with the game, which could, make Kyle Shanahan, who was an offensive coordinator for the first time when I believe he was 29 years old. It's the same way with McVay in Washington, who, is 29 or 30 years old, and he's had some head coaching interviews this year. It's really impressive. But do you think that, what with the fact that the Falcons are still alive for the playoffs, does any of that weigh on Atlanta? Does any of the, the interviews or the rumors about Shanahan weigh on the Falcons? And do you think that could prove to be a distraction, or does it really not matter?
I don't think it matters at all. I mean, I think the coaches kind of are used to this now. Chris Richard had an interview with Buffalo this week. So, and Tom Cable, I think, is set to meet with the 49ers on Sunday. So if it's having an issue with the Falcons, you could just as easily say, is it going to have an issue with the Seahawks? Because, their guys are getting requests for interview as well. I just think it's one of those things. I think that I can't imagine what it must be like having to conduct an interview. I can't remember who it was, actually. It's one of the guys, I think maybe Josh McDaniels, had like 3 or 4 interviews in one day. I can't imagine what that's quite like, given I imagine these are pretty, stressful meetings that you end up having, trying to persuade somebody to make you their head coach, trying to get your vision across to, to different teams. So I can imagine it's quite difficult. But yeah, I think it's going to be the same for both teams. I can't imagine it being too much of a distraction. It kind of looks as if Kyle Shanahan's going to be without a job, unless, of course, Atlanta loses and he can, quickly get straight into the market. But Buffalo have got a coach now. Denver's got a coach now. And that could have been a place where Shanahan was considered. Who else has got Jacksonville's got a head coach now, so that you're really looking at San Francisco and LA. And it looks as if Los Angeles are going to be going with the Washington offensive coordinator, the younger guy. And it seems as if they are quite enamored with him. I think he had a second interview with them today, and all the talk seems to be around the 49ers going with Josh McDaniels. So, well, he may end up staying in Atlanta. So that would be very good news for the Atlanta Falcons because their offense has been sensational this year. Not quite so good news, though, for Kyle Shanahan's head coaching ambitions.
If we finish on a note of predicting the Seahawks game, or what we think is going to happen on Saturday, 1:30 Pacific Standard Time, Seahawks-Falcons. Winner goes to the NFC Championship game. Obviously, the biggest game of the year. We get to have a big game here. A lot of things going on. Rob, what is your prediction for Saturday?
Well, obviously, I hope sincerely that the Seahawks win. Nothing would give me more joy this weekend unless the birth of my daughter occurs at game time. Nothing would give me more joy other than that than the Seahawks winning this game. I mean, I just love. I hate the idea that this could be it, Kenny. That this is the last game for months on end. I hate the off season after the draft because you get to sort of June and you're kind of thinking, how many weeks to go until training camp, and then how many weeks to go until the start of the season. You kind of count down the preseason games, hoping nobody gets injured and stuff like that. It's such a laborious time without football and without specifically Seahawks football. That you kind of have to enjoy these moments. And look, there's going to be a time down the line when the Seahawks aren't in the playoffs anymore. And then they're going to be one of the teams that maybe are missing out every year. And we're going to think back to these days and think, I wish I'd just been more excited about those playoff games, or, not dreaded them as much, because they're not going to be here forever. And I sincerely hope the Seahawks are going to win. I really do. And they've got a chance. It'd be daft to say they haven't got a chance. Of course they've got a chance. They beat New England on the road. That said, I am going to predict the Falcons are going to win. I'm going to make a head decision as opposed to a heart decision on making this prediction. They've been such an explosive offense all year. They are the home team. I think if it was at CenturyLink, I'd be predicting the Seahawks to win without doubt. But it's in Atlanta, so I'm going to predict them to win. I think it might be quite close. I could see it coming down to a potential last possession type of thing. I could see it being a 3 or 4 point game. I just think the onus is on the Seahawks to keep up, and I cannot trust this offense. They've been too streaky for the last few weeks. They struggled to establish their identity. They struggled to be who they want to be. And with a record of 1-4-1 on the road in the NFC this year, I have to go with the Falcons, and I'm going to go 23-17 to the Falcons.
23-17 Falcons, totally understandable. I have to begin by saying I believe the Seahawks are a better team than the Falcons. If you go piece by piece, you really start to break it down with all of the and you can even just start at the fact that Pete Carroll is a proven winner that has taken the Seahawks to the second round of the playoffs in 6 of 7 seasons. I mean, what he does here is unprecedented in Seattle, but it's also incredibly difficult to match for any franchise. So I think even starting at the top, even the Falcons, I mean, their head coach comes from Pete Carroll's tree. I mean, everything about it starts with Pete Carroll. And I think that for so many reasons, the Seahawks start off better than the Falcons. And you can break it down and say, what about quarterback to quarterback? Well, if you had polled 100 people in August whether or not Russell Wilson was better than Matt Ryan, I don't even think it would have been close. Matt Ryan was not in the same circle as Russell Wilson going into this season. Matt Ryan was a very good quarterback for his entire career that couldn't get the job done, was always hovering around being much better, and is coming off of a season last year in which he was fairly mediocre, and then just comes out this year and becomes a completely different person to all of us in the way that he is perceived. in a way that is like saying, well, he's going to win the MVP. This is a guy who up until this season had never posted a passer rating of 100 over a single season, and he posts a passer rating of 117.1. I think that Russell Wilson is the better quarterback than Matt Ryan. But right now, Matt Ryan, with the way the offense is constructed to perfectly work for Matt Ryan, with the job that Kyle Shanahan does, Matt Ryan is the more efficient quarterback this season and the better quarterback right now. So even starting there, I see the Seahawks having the better quarterback, but Matt Ryan being the better quarterback in these games, especially at home, especially in this situation. But even if you started to take it down there, I think the Seahawks have as much as they can hope to have on offense, with this, other than the loss of Tyler Lockett. They've got Jimmy Graham, they've got Doug Baldwin, they've got Thomas Rawls, and those are three guys that I think are the most important to have. But if they have this added bonus of CJ Prosise, that's a huge difference. If they have Paul Richardson playing like he did a week ago, that's a big difference. And then on defense, it's not even that close for me. The Falcons had a bad defense this year. It's not about whether or not that the offense, was able to pick up a defense that was ranked, number 10. The Falcons are 27th on defense. They're 29th against the run. They're just a bad defense. But you could look at it piece by piece and look at the Falcons defense and say, well, Deion Jones, Keanu Neal, Vic Beasley, these are guys that you would love to build a team around. But two of those guys are rookies. Vic Beasley's in his second year. They don't have Desmond Trufant. There's plenty about this defense that's just plain not good. And I think with that, you're going to see the Seahawks be able to put up some points. So with all that being said, the Seahawks are still playing on the road. They went to the Los Angeles Rams, the 30th ranked team in the NFL by DVOA. They lost 9-3. They went and played the New York Jets, a team ranked 32nd, dead last in DVOA. They won 27-17, but it was a little bit closer than you would expect a good team to play the worst team in the NFL. They played the Arizona Cardinals, an average team. They score 6 points. They go play the Saints. They lose 25-20. They go and they play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They score 5 points. They go and they play the Green Bay Packers in Green Bay. They get blown out for the first time in 5 years, 38-10. They go and they play the San Francisco 49ers, who were ranked 28th in DVOA. They win by 2 points. So you can't compare it in talent to talent. You can't compare it overall to overall. As a road team, the Seahawks are maybe the 25th best team in the NFL. They're just not a very good team on the road. Chalk it up to whatever you want to chalk it up to. In a neutral situation, the Seahawks win this game by 10 points plus because they're a better defense with a comparable offense in terms of talent. I still think, obviously, the Falcons have proven that they're the better offense. But in terms of having quarterbacks, they're right there neck and neck. But because the game is on the road, I've got the Falcons winning 31-27. It's tough for me to pick the Seahawks to win on the road. That's it. Me and Rob have both picked the Falcons to beat the Seahawks. Hopefully being the underdog is a good thing for Seattle in this case. Any final thoughts, Rob?
Yeah, I hope we're both wrong. Apart from that, I'm sure we'll both agree, Kenny, that, even though we've picked the Falcons, neither of us want that to happen. We both believe, I think, that the Seahawks can win this game. We're just making a prediction here. There's no point just saying the Seahawks are going to win for the sake of it, just so that, we're being positive about the situation. The idea is with a prediction is to say what you honestly think. And, I hope people don't take that the wrong way.
And they beat the Patriots in New England. So good luck figuring anything out.
That's it. But, it's just, Detroit was the perfect type of game for the Seahawks because, it gave them an opportunity to get back to what they do best. That was a Seahawks type of win. That's the Seahawks that we've come to expect under Pete Carroll. And it was refreshing to see that kind of performance. And it gives everybody the kind of hope now that, this can be, a great postseason run, that they can be the 2011 Giants or whatever and go through here and get some momentum going in and take this all the way through to the Super Bowl. But you kind of have to see it to believe it. And this is a team that has been great one week and then awful the next. So, even if they just played consistently well for 3 or 4 weeks, you would sort of think, yes, okay. But they don't. They kind of lurch from one extreme to the other. if they go into Atlanta and do what they did on Saturday in Atlanta and win the game, then there'll be nobody's going to stop me sort of picking the Seahawks in the NFC Championship game if they've got that momentum and they're rolling. But I kind of need to see it, especially on the road. And I just hope that they can find some level of balance on offense and find a few big plays on defense, find a special team spark from somebody just to sort of get this going. And fingers crossed it happens, because I really, really hope that they could win this game.
Yeah, and it'll come down to, the Falcons are 1-5 when they don't score 30 points. So, if the Seahawks defense can come up, they didn't win the scoring title, but that's not necessarily the last and only thing. They finished third in scores points allowed, and they had 5 games this season where they allowed 10 or fewer, which was the most in the NFL. So if the scoring defense comes to play, if the defense comes to play, if the offense doesn't make mistakes, very winnable game. It's just hard to pick them to win given how they played on the road. The Seahawks, the Falcons, Saturday, 1:35 p.m. on Fox here, locally PST. You can follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staten. Go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com for everything about the Seahawks, and as well as it pertains to the draft. You can check out Rob's post-game posts that he says, that he said he will be writing as well. Those come out after every game. Some quick thoughts. Check out FieldGoals.com. We got plenty of stuff coming at you. And this is kind of 3000 NFL mock draft. We're just diverting during the playoffs to make sure that the focus is on the Seahawks. A very exciting national title game. We'll get back to the draft and such when necessary, but hopefully we don't have to get back to the draft for at least a few more weeks. Let's see if the Seahawks can pull out a win, go to the NFC Championship game for the third time under Carroll, go to the Super Bowl for the third time under Carroll, and just continue to talk about the Seahawks for the next 3+ weeks and focus on that. Very good, exciting stuff going on, and hopefully not a first half like they had against the Carolina Panthers last year when they went down 31-0. This has been 3000 NFL Mock Draft. This has been this edition. Tune in next week for a new draft.